Welcome to episode 3 of Reading to Mom. My name is Joe. I am the publisher of Historia Research Press in Chicago. As we've explained previously, one of our authors, our only author, is reading to his mother during the COVID-19 pandemic while she is self-quarantined hundreds of miles away in a different state. So, episode 2, chapter 1 of Arcane Cage. What can we say? If you're an aspiring writer, I highly recommend that you start with a beginning, a middle, and an end. It really helps to clarify the story that you're trying to tell, as you quite obviously witnessed during the previous episode. As best we can tell, the acrimonious debates the author references on several occasions are actually just conflicts in his mind, as he hasn't worked out all the details of the story he would like to tell. So you have contradictions, like, is your enemy a mountain or is it not a mountain? Is the Provenance the world's first social democracy or an empire? Are the Provenance and Lyman warring civilizations, or are they parts of one larger civilization? Well, these are questions, obviously, that the first chapter raises and that the second chapter doesn't address. In any case, it is my pleasure, such as it is, to introduce the author of Arcane Cage, reading to his mom. Hi, Mom. I'm happy that you liked the second episode of Reading to Mom, and more gratified, honestly, that you understood the structure to Chapter 1 of Arcane Cage. I didn't intend to write a historical narrative. It is a chronicle or a series of episodic events, places, and people who were significant during a period of time that lasted over 3,000 years. Yeah, as you know through the citations, it's collected from a variety of sources, primary sources in historical lingo, and there was no real way to control for all the inconsistencies of the different perspectives on what happened during this long but very important part of our history. I chose not to reconcile these inconsistencies as a reflection of something I learned from a German sociologist, Max Weber. The modern mind will often seek to rationalize or intellectualize the objects of its study to a point where mystery and magic are stripped from the world, or the world becomes disenchanted. By allowing these different perspectives to persist or exist in a chronicle, the reader is able to see that there's something that's not quite resolved as they enter into this new world that they perhaps have never heard of or studied before in world history. Chapter 2 is then an introduction or a story about the origin of arcane philosophy, also known as the classical powers, what today we might call the origin of magic. And it is an attempt to allow the reader, the modern reader, to enter into a world that has not yet been disenchanted. Chapter 2. On the point of departure. If the character of its people determined the meaningfulness and boundaries of the Provenance during the Arcane Age, nothing determined that character more than arcane philosophy. For it was the classical powers of clerics, wizards, paladins, and their counterparts that sundered the Godhead's absolute authority over the states, the economies, and the religions of the preternatural age. Prior to the arcane wisdoms, no idea, no knowledge, no vision, no tiny corner of the universe escaped the omnipotent purview of the Godheads. Then, like a lightning strike, sudden and powerful, the new knowledge shattered the crystalline vaults of the occultist order fortified by personal wonder and social worship for the Godheads. The classical powers permeated the everyday aspirations and workaday routines of the peoples of the Domain during the entirety of the Arcane Age. This was just as true for the common people, who never proved capable of casting a single spell or performing a feat of kinetic prowess. The culture of the Arcane Age, the whole way of life in the Domain, set its foundations upon the classical powers. Thus, no history of the Provenance, however brief, may begin without a priestess on the first recorded event in the annals of arcane philosophy, or the origins of magic, as it is commonly called in our popular discourse. One of the great ironies of history, perhaps, is that the stranglehold of a totalitarian regime breaks in one and only one way, an unanticipated abruptness. As an eternal testament to this historical fact, the discovery of the classical powers originated from the tireless crusade of the Godheads to sustain their hegemony over the 7 cities of the preternatural age. From time immemorial, the Godheads reigned without the remotest hint of insurrection or serious social instability in the Domain. Suddenly, one day, they ruled no more. A myth passed down to our time attributes the first sign of the decline of the Godheads to an overworked field peasant in Naxos, the city situated in the southeastern Domain. At Naxos, the Godhead required all of his subjects, even a woman in her final term of pregnancy, to work the fields during the harvest season. A preternatural adage of the deity records the severity of the Naxian commandments. A verse. Domain ceases not to carry us on her back when she is pregnant with our seeds. End verse. Footnote 1. Acts M. Brew. In The Naxian Ethic and the Spirit of the Classical Powers, published in Freiburg, 653 of the Golden Age, from page 181. Brew remains the most authoritative account of the late preternatural age, and few scholars have improved on his ordering and interpretation of the extant textual fragments from the period. And footnote. A preternatural adage of the deity records the severity of the Naxian commandments. Domain ceases not to carry us on her back when she is pregnant with our seeds. An unfortunate drudge, later known as Panthema in the ancient Elvish tongue, who labored under the Naxian lord's brutal schedule, lost a child in miscarriage. Certainly not the first to suffer such a fate beneath the lashes of the Godheads, more certainly not the last. What renders Panthema's personal tragedy into the age-altering event it became was her response. Panthema cursed the Godhead. Possibly it had never occurred to an enslaved drudger to curse a Godhead for the lot bestowed on his penitent multitudes. Perchance it never occurred to the downtrodden that it was no mystery why a Godhead visits senseless tragedies on its worshipful masses. In her seminal act of defiance, nonetheless, Panthema let loose a terrifying, liberating truth that brought to a close the silent misery of her faithful parish. Mortals need not live at the pleasure of immortals. The Godhead of Naxos fell gravely ill soon afterward, quote, engrossed by a mysterious wickedness, unquote, that stripped immortality from the High Lord. The coterie of nobles who tended the stricken deity summoned the best minds of the city to dedicate themselves to the recovery of their Godhead. Long and serious study of metaphysics, the arch principles of the cosmic order, yielded no results. A verse. The chastened lord of Naxos languished near death, afflicted by Panthema's hedonic hex, mortified in flesh 5 months, 1 week, 2 days. End verse. Footnote 2. From Brew, The Naxian Ethic, page 191. End footnote. A verse. The chastened lord of Naxos languished near death, afflicted by Panthema's hedonic hex, mortified in flesh, 5 months, 1 week, 2 days. End verse. At the end of that term, the nobles' efforts to reverse Panthema's hex finally resulted in a cure, a remarkable cure. Months after the Godhead was stricken with the malediction, during the first days of the spring thaw, a nobleman discovered a theretofore unknown power to heal all manner of illnesses. Following an unusually harsh winter, during which the Godhead failed to invoke the ritual blessings to welcome in springtime, an inexplicable illness struck the livestock of Naxos. The city teetered on the edge of total collapse, godless and in starvation. In that moment, a noble, a relatively minor one, who often worked in the fields alongside his peons, discovered a startling new power that healed his stricken livestock. After a short period of meditation in the morning, the crafty noble learned to combine a specific set of spoken words and hand gestures that enabled him, quote, to summon forth a dark cloud, unquote, from his diseased livestock, miraculously returning the beast to good health. Several weeks later, after his livestock miraculously recovered, other nobles heard of the strange artifice that he now possessed. The city folk pressed the noble healer into restoring the stricken cattle throughout the city. Not long thereafter, a coterie of nobles who had dedicated themselves to the recovery of the godhead learned word of the celebrated nobleman. At their insistence, the noble cleric visited the godhead and uttered a few well-chosen incantations, accompanied by ritualistic gestures, while laying his hands on the godhead. The godhead instantly returned from the brink of mortality, spry and fresh, as if the long barren months of the malady had not occurred whatsoever. A verse. Ungracious, ungrateful, averted from death, the Lord of Naxos smote the noble healer. End verse. Footnote 3. From Brew, the Naxian Ethic, page 239. End footnote. A verse. Ungracious, ungrateful, averted from death, the Lord of Naxos smote the noble healer. As passed down in the oral traditions, the myth of the stricken godhead recorded the discovery of the classical power of healing at the close of the preternatural age. Footnote 4. There's a long-standing historical dispute, often acrimonious, between history buffs and academics, whether the hex or the cure represents the first use of the classical powers. Many argue that there's no possible way a ratty peasant woman, quote-unquote, invented the classical powers. Such powers required time available only to nobles to acquire the learnedness and acumen necessary for philosophical discovery. To which opponents counter, to what enigmatic magic do you attribute the hex? Brew, an insightful if verbose author, favors the healing energy of nobles over the revolutionary power of the more mundane class. End footnote. Despite efforts to quash the rumors swirling around the nobles' restoration of the godhead's health, word quickly spread throughout the domain. Footnote 5. Quickly, that is, for the age. The domesticated horse and the axle had not yet been invented. The people of the domain traveled often by foot. The areas between the cities remained dangerous as well, and only contingents of the 101-handed one, the mercenaries who served the godheads, moved between the cities. Most communications between the cities were of an official nature, carried out on the orders of the godheads. Consequently, it was at least 5 years before the furthest city from Naxos received news of a miraculous healing power for the godheads. End footnote. Despite efforts to quash the rumors swirling around the nobles' restoration of the godhead's health, word quickly spread throughout the domain, and a new, little-understood therapy for the befallen captured the imagination of the age. Many nobles dedicated themselves to learn the new craft in order to ingratiate themselves with their lords. Yet the sorcery of the nobles, quote, as one early peasant aspersion named the arcane art, more often than not beguiled the ruling class. Very few members of the nobility succeeded in mastering elementary skills in the first and oldest of the classical powers. Early on, clerical healing was thought to originate in some form or fashion from the heavens. After suppression of knowledge regarding the nobles' new healing powers became untenable, the godhead of Naxos proposed, by way of explanation, that clerics' powers derived from their communion with the, quote, absolute spirit of eminent domain, close quote. A new law incorporated into the city's statement of principles limited mastery of the clerical craft to the most loyal servants of benevolent despotism, quote unquote. And footnote 6. The godhead of Naxos amended the city's statement of principles after the discovery of clerical healing to restrict the use of all classical powers to the longevity and security of the state, without success, it must be noted. It is the last and only written record of emendation to a city's statement of principles during the preternatural age. See Ihophrates, Characters, Book 7, published in Naxos around 1453 of the Metal Age. End footnote. Following the example of severity made by the lawgiver of Naxos, in time, the godheads at each of the 7 cities solicited or coerced the most powerful practitioners of the classical power of healing to become trusted and obedient diviners of the restorative arts. The discovery produced unanticipated outcomes, however, when the commoners of Naxos found that some in their rank also possessed a facility with the curative powers. Soon, a faction of clerics who ranked among commoners at birth chose to serve the people of their stature exclusively, without regard for the godheads. Even the least artful healers, in solidarity with their ilk, gained renown as peons to their city-states. Although some commoners tested their talents in the curative powers with an eye to the promise of state wealth and deistic laurels, the vast majority of clerics who rose from the rank of commoners became enthralled in all earnestness with a power that defied the nobility. Notably, the seven godheads failed to master healing in their own right, prompting the commoners to regard such knowledge as, quote, beyond the dominion of the lawgivers, close quote. Common knowledge thus gave rise to alternative theories on the nature of the classical powers. In a challenge to the nobles' notions that clerics channeled their abilities from the heavens, the commoners embellished an account that hinted at the revolutionary implications of a knowledge that eluded the power of the godheads. The folk declared that the clerics possessed wisdom, quote unquote, and the earliest masters gained the honorary title of philosophers, lovers of wisdom, quote unquote. Footnote 7. Even after the discovery of the other classical powers, the moniker of philosopher, or lover of wisdom in the modern translation, remained popular, and the title applied generally to any person who mastered a classical power. The etymological links among arcane and modern terms are found in Colgin's vocabulary. End footnote. The folk declared that their clerics possessed wisdom, and the earliest masters gained the honorary title of philosophers, lovers of wisdom. In hindsight, the shift in perception seems inconsequential. The break, however, from the dictations of revelation and prophecy recast nature, the whole world, as a stage on which even the lowliest common folk may aspire to greatness and rewards. By the time the new wisdom of healing spread to the townspeople of all seven cities, the clerical philosophers gradually rivaled the godheads as benefactors of the people. In myths, once dismissed as fanciful stories by scholars, Arcane Age bards immortalized the first clerics of Naxos as the harbingers of civilization, who first taught the commoners about the light of wisdom and freedom. Footnote 8. The term cleric is modern and usually related to religious practices. Nevertheless, this work uses the term cleric to avoid confusion, since the arcane words for a cleric have no modern derivations. Capturing the social conflict that clerical healing spawned, our ancestors had different terms for clerics. Peon seems to have been a derogatory term employed by noble clerics against common clerics, the peons to the peons. The commoners preferred the name exokiomon, which roughly means one who heals completely. The godhead and nobles tended to use the term theurgian, meaning divine worker, when referring to clerics of the nobility. As is evident, the commoners use the term that suggests what clerics do, while the godhead and nobles use the terms that suggest for whom such clerical powers should be reserved, the ruling class. End footnote. Like nobles, the vast majority of commoners found themselves unable to harness the clerical powers. Unlike the nobility, the desire for wisdom sparked an unprecedented age of ingenuity and improvements that revealed the first seven classical powers and their secrets to the known world. Word of the second classical power, discovered in the city of Libua, situated in the fields of domesticated grains of the Central Plains, reached the four corners of the domain in less than a year. Frustrated by their efforts to commune with the starry heavens, a small cooperative of horticulturalists astutely concluded that the fecund ground and seedlings of the domain conceivably possessed powers to complement the sky above. The dirt groomer's labor uncovered the wisdom of druids. Footnote 9. In contrast to cleric, the modern word druid is very close to its arcane cognate, druinon, meaning oaken, in reference to the sturdy oak tree. A few scholars surmise that the name indicates that acorns were the first nut to reveal the classical power of druids, but no written records from the period confirm this hypothesis. End footnote. The dirt groomer's labor uncovered the wisdom of druids. At first, the druidic classical powers seemed to be no more than a different form of healing art. The most venturous scholars, however, ascertained that the domesticated seedlings produced the least powerful effects. Youthful druids who experimented with the consumption of rare specimens of mushroom spores first learned of the druidic ability to shapeshift into the birds and predators of the forest. Other exuberant students created extracts from roots, long known in the domain but disregarded as inedible or lacking nutrition, that granted powers to befriend wild animals and control monstrous beasts. Eventually, the enterprise to uncover the phenomenon of this classical power spurred an immense taxonomy of wild roots, fungi, and seeds that made druidic philosophy a highly technical wisdom that few intellectuals mastered entirely. Footnote 10. The proficiency to gain admittance to a druidic guild required years of intensive studies, but the powers associated with most common types of roots, seeds, and fungi became widely known among the commoners and, unsurprisingly, form the basis for many homeopathic herbal remedies still used today. In fact, the first popular collection on herbal medicines, Hanifa's Tome of Plants, which detailed the gustatory and medicinal aspects of 631 plentiful plants, circulated in the middle period of the Arcane Age, published in Libya around the 6th epoch, first period of the Arcane Age. An Arab scholar, al-Dinawari, translated the work for posterity under the same title during the late Metal Age, in Baghdad, 3853 of the Metal Age. The third and fifth volumes of al-Dinawari's manuscript are on display at the House of Arcane Wisdoms in Gandhishpur, Iran. End footnote. Eventually, the enterprise to uncover the phenomenon of this classical power spurred an immense taxonomy of wild roots, fungi, and seeds that made druidic philosophy a highly technical wisdom that few intellectuals mastered entirely. Nonetheless, the breakthroughs in druidic wisdom triggered the revelation of 5 additional classical powers. In Panoptes, the charming city north of Naxos, along the watery coast of the East Lyman, a woman, who had spent much of her adult life homeless after her village unceremoniously cast out her mother as an apostate and a psychic, wrote a treatise on the nature of the universe that changed the course of history for the domain. Footnote 11. Agrigentum's treatise on nature, published in Panoptes around the 6th epoch, 3rd period of the preternatural age, like many other volumes on the classical powers, was lost to posterity after the First Great War. Arcane sources indicate that the full treatise consisted of 4,999 lines of hexameter poetry, a line of verse, and 11 syllables. Of the 557 lines that most scholars currently regard as original and accurate quotations, the majority record the innocuous innovations of her thought and little insight into how our ancestors summoned forth the classical powers. End footnote. Reasoning that the first 2 classical powers derived from distinct forces of nature, Agrigentum argued that the classical powers of clerics and druids tapped into 2 unrelated and primal substances of the cosmos. She labeled these Geos and Ether. In consideration of the divergent abilities of clerics and druids, she surmised that 2 additional primal substances rounded out the basic cosmogony of the universe, Anime and Zephyr. The first vivified the kingdom of animals and locomotive life forms. The latter actuated the kingdom of plants, the immobile life forms. Footnote 12. The specific lines in Agrigentum's work that defines the differences between plant and animal life are lost to posterity. What is known about her classification of Zephyr and Anime is much more nuanced and subtle than the distinction in locomotive and immobile life forms. To reduce the burden on the reader, however, such considerations will be postponed until the narrative warrants further background on her system for arcane philosophies. End footnote. Anime and Zephyr. The first vivified the kingdom of animals and locomotive life forms. The latter actuated the kingdom of plants, the immobile life forms. The resulting classificatory system rendered Geos and Ether as the 2 lifeless elements representing the domain and the heavens, Anime and Zephyr as the 2 life elements of the beings that populated both. See Illustration 3. Illustration 3. Arcane Philosophy of the 4 Elements. From Agrigentum's On Nature. The 4 elements are Ether, Anime, Zephyr, and Geos, represented by the 4 arcane symbols shown here. There are two elemental types, lifeless and life, the lifeless being antipodal, and each of the elements have a specific reference. Ether to sky sun, anime to locomotion in animals, zephyr to mobility in plants, and geos to earth and soil. And illustration 3. The resulting classificatory system rendered geos and ether as the two lifeless elements representing the domain in the heavens, anime and zephyr as the two life elements of the beings that populated both. Agrigentum's first postulate theorized that the classical powers commingled two elements together to release the generative might of the universe in particular forms. Footnote 13. The Golden Age critic Boone D. Murky suggested that Agrigentum's cosmogony is nothing more than an analogy for the revolutionary social ethos of the period. He satirizes her premise that life and lifeless elements combined in some way to release the essential forces of nature as a perversion rooted in popular folklore that held that commoners and wisdom combined to liberate the people. See Murky's Reflections on the Glorious Revolution of the Provenance, published in London, 541 of the Golden Age. End footnote. In practice, clerics combined the elements of anime and ether, while druids combined the elements of zephyr and geos. In her second postulate, Agrigentum surmised that none of the elements were exact opposites in an antagonistic or incompatible fashion. All four elements combined with each other in nature to create all things as we know them. A verse. Elements equal, each holds its own station, discloses its prime nature undivided, nothing adds to them, nothing passes away. Neither empty nor full, unbound nor fettered, elements prevail, whilst melodies unfold. End verse. And footnote 14. Agrigentum on Nature, lines 1483 to 1487. With the exception of two minor edits to punctuation, my translation follows Aruba Rankschrift's hendecameter translation from the first arcane philosophers of the Provenance, published in London, 647 of the Golden Age. Although nearly a few centuries old, his poetic rendering of Agrigentum's lines have not been surpassed. End footnote. A verse. Elements equal, each holds its own station, discloses its prime nature undivided. Nothing adds to them, nothing passes away, neither empty nor full, unbound nor fettered. Elements prevail, whilst melodies unfold. End verse. Nonetheless, Agrigentum characterized geos and ether as the antipodal elements, since the fertile soil and bright sky combined in a delicate harmony that contained the primal substances of life. She then distinguished the combinations of the elements and the classical powers with respect to their relationship with geos and ether. If clerics united anime and ether, then there must be, she speculated, one classical power that employed zephyr and ether together. Likewise, if druids cultivated zephyr and geos, yet another classical power drew upon anime and geos in unison. Thus her third postulate stated that a total of four reciprocal classical powers combined the lifeless and life elements, calling forth capacities that lie dormant among the mortal peoples of the domain, clerical, druidic, and two reciprocal classes yet to be discovered. Lastly, in her fourth and final postulate, Agrigentum posited that there remain two arcane classical powers, so named to indicate their unique relationship to the four elements. The first, a combination of the life elements anime and zephyr, she passed over only briefly without speculating on its potential. The second, a mixture of the lifeless and antipodal elements geos and ether, she named the classical power of thaumaturgy. From line 3067 of On Nature, thaumaturgy consorts substances in strife. Footnote 15. Agrigentum's term, thaumergia, roughly translates as works of wonder. While that term became obsolete, Agrigentum uses the word magico, the root of our modern and popular term magician. Wizard has a more modern origin, but retains the meaning inherent to Agrigentum's system. One who has wisdom. That is, a philosopher. The term wizard is used interchangeably with magician in this work. End footnote. Thaumaturgy consorts substances in strife. Though the entire passage no longer remains extant, the subsequent 263 lines of On Nature revealed that Agrigentum's mother possessed the classical power to commingle geos and ether, and that in only a few short weeks, the two working together harnessed several of the easiest abilities, such as clairvoyance, the power to hear the mind's unspoken words, and light, the ability to send darkness away. So it was the third of the classical powers came to be known throughout the domain, wizardry. Agrigentum also correctly predicted that the arcane classical powers would prove to be the most difficult to master, such that only a very small percentage of all the peoples of the domain should hope to find a calling in the arcane classical powers. Consequently, the final books of her work outline an ethical system that implored arcanists, or arcane philosophers, to use their powers for the good of all commoners. Defend the common weal, nature's quintessence. Line 4889. All in all, Agrigentum's cosmogony was a remarkable feat of reasoning and ingenuity that became a clarion call for classical research and arcane philosophy during the second age of the domain, the aptly named Arcane Age. Footnote 16. The term arcane became the conventional name for the second era of the domain in its own time. Only recently, however, did modern scholars uncover substantial pieces of Agrigentum's cosmogony and come to understand her seminal influence on the consciousness and culture of the domain for many, many centuries. It may aptly be called the Age of Agrigentum as well. End footnote. A tale that accompanied the circulation of Agrigentum's written work rounds out our narrative. The story further relates how the city of Panoptes received her work and the disclosure of a third classical power. Reportedly, the godhead of Panoptes condemned Agrigentum for hearsay and forced her to defend the veracity of her work in a public test of her claims, after she failed to demonstrate any arcane abilities. Footnote 17. The godhead of Panoptes astutely forbade the mother from demonstrating her powers at the trial, believing that mind-reading gimmicks and illumination constituted little threat to the theocracy. It later came to light that Agrigentum failed to uncover any latent powers for wizardry, and in fact at length learned that she was not able to master any of the four classical powers known during her lifetime. It was one of the first signs that the ability to call forth the classical powers was not passed down from parent to child like a hereditary trait. End footnote. Reportedly, the godhead of Panoptes condemned Agrigentum for hearsay and forced her to defend the veracity of her work in a public test of her claims. After she failed to demonstrate any arcane abilities, the godhead ruled against her and set state officials, the noble rank who apparently despised her ethical system, upon her to hang her from the tallest oak in the city as an example to those who transgressed the laws of the godheads. In fear of her daughter's life, the mother hurled some kind of luminescent balls at the gang of noble executioners, nearly killing the lot of them with a fusillade of starry globes. Thusly defended, the mother wizard temporarily secured both vindication for her daughter among the commoners and mercy from her daughter's would-be assailants. Before long, a second denizen of Panoptes stepped forward to demonstrate that he too had a knack for arcane philosophy, after learning to fling frightful magic missiles at his adversaries, to be sure. Concurrently, several clerics and druids of Panoptes endorsed the elemental system of classical powers, claiming that Agrigentum's work quickened their research into the curative and organic wisdoms. When a nobleman came forth to declare himself a wizard, the godhead of Panoptes finally relented and pardoned Agrigentum without admitting any misjudgment. Subsequently, Agrigentum and her mother withdrew from the threat posed by the vengeful deity of Panoptes and migrated to the south, settling on the eastern side of the Ferris Mountains. There, the two mothers of the Arcane Age erected a tower to serve as a lyceum, a kind of school that fostered the mutuality of teaching and learning, wherein students and teachers shared the responsibilities for lectures, research, and scribing. Quickly, Agrigentum's tower drew an assortment of soothsayers, enchanters, illusionists, conjurers, and other miscreant commoners to explore and to augment the classical power of wizardry according to her elemental and ethical system. Although the godhead of Panoptes sought to suppress Agrigentum's treaties to safeguard the only known noble wizard in the domain, reproductions of the text reached the other godheads as well as the commoners in all 7 cities. The cosmogony described in the text drew out many new wizards from the nobles and commoners alike. The research methodology outlined in the work also pointed to new class abilities for druids and clerics. Footnote 18. In city after city, commoners and nobles unveiled their arcane powers in mere weeks after the circulation of Agrigentum's text. But often the vulnerable wizards concealed themselves until after they learned to cast magic missiles at their malicious doubters. End footnote. Without doubt, however, the most significant and profound influence was the discovery of several reciprocal classical powers: rangers, fighters, and rogues. Agrinio, the west-central city of lakes and evergreens, with its immense menagerie of wild game and elemental beasts, produced the first man to fuse the generative pollen of zephyr and the vapors of ether. Rangers, as they came to be known, gained a reputation as wild or free spirits who defied all social authority and codes of etiquette, typically disappearing into the wilderness to make do on their own. Footnote 19. The Torod, the preternatural age tome for the classical powers of rangers, is itself lost to posterity. Kivon's Wisdom of the Torod elegantly recounts the origins of the first rangers of the domain. The term ranger, like cleric, has more modern origins. Kivon uses two distinct words for rangers that suggest the modern term is true to the original meaning. Kedimon, which translates as protector or guardian, and Panion, meaning wanderer, roamer, or rover. The latter term is particularly interesting as it suggests an antiquated connection with the heavenly planets, planets, then known as the wandering stars in the sky. End footnote. Rangers, as they came to be known, gained a reputation as wild and free spirits who defied all social authority and codes of etiquette, typically disappearing into the wilderness to make do on their own. Rangers presently earn notoriety for their abilities to survive in nature, to move fluidly through all kinds of overgrowth, to befriend beasts of the domain, and to hold a mystifying personal grudge against their enemies. For this reason, the godheads of the seven cities prized rangers for their capacity to track and dominate an isolated opponent, only slightly more than they distrusted rangers due to their independent, capricious character. While news reached the other cities at different times, the city of Pellene in the Ferris Mountains of the east and the city of Titios in the Orphean Mountains of the far west jointly shared the honor of unmasking the classical powers of combat. In addition, their separate exploits to conjoin Geos and anime revealed a new wrinkle in the practice of the classical powers. Simultaneous discoveries in the two cities resulted in two different classes of melee combat: force and finesse. The melee combatants, who became known as fighters, mastered techniques to control physical matter and momentum in ways that made them formidable opponents in close range. Feats of weaponry and brute force easily differentiated fighters from the lowly mercenaries who served the godheads as tax collectors and regulators in the preternatural age. In contrast, the melee combatants, who gained respect and infamy as rogues, manipulated tensile energies and anatomical motion to take advantage of finesse and accuracy to fell a lumbering monster, as well as filch a gold coin or hide in shadows from a pretentious noble. Rogues' artistry and precision awed commoners, who tended to romanticize roguery as a vocation that robbed from the rich and benefited the poor, despite ample evidence that rogues avidly adhered to the statement of principles of Titios that celebrated greed and self-interest far more than rank or allegiances. Footnote 20. One peculiarity of our world is that it has given us so many different words to describe one of its oldest professions: soldiers. The popular term fighter has no relationship to the word that once described the classical power. Fighters as a whole were not an enthusiastically literate class, so scholars remain uncertain of the exact name for this classical power. One thorough argument prefers strateon, simply meaning warrior. Another persuasive statement suggests makimo, or fit for battle, warlike, as the original designation of the class. Until more and more revealing sources are uncovered, the subject is open to debate. On the other hand, the term rogue has more than a remote similarity to its epic origin. Panurgon, with several related meanings: 1. Ready to do anything wicked or knavish; 2. Knave or rogue; 3. like the fox, and 4, cunning, clever, or smart. End footnote. As if contemptuous of their elemental parentage, rogues and fighters often targeted each other as arch-enemies. Nevertheless, when a rogue and a fighter shared mutual esteem for one another, no pair of adventurers posed a greater threat to arcane opponents or more sizable opposition during the Arcane Age. The unexpected discovery of 2 different powers from the combination of Geos and Anime seemed to retard consideration of the second arcane classical power, presumably the final classical power. Agrigentum herself, certain that Geos and Ether represented the 2 primordial substances of the cosmos, seemed to downplay the significance and capacities of philosophers who might one day tie together the 2 life elements of Anime and Zephyr. Many thought mistakenly that rogues actually utilized the 2 life elements. Added to this, as gossip surrounding torrential icy storms and explosive fiery balls reached a fevered pitch, the 2 antipodal elements of the wizards portended the greatest potential for both creative and destructive forces. The burgeoning canon of new enchantments and spells further engendered disinterest in a purported second arcane classical power that promised few benefits over wizardry. Thus, for nearly 3 centuries, under these unfavorable intellectual conditions, the original 6 classical powers constituted the aspirations for distinction among the nobles and dominated the unshackled imagination of the commoners in the domain. Footnote 21. Agrigentum's treatise provided no direct insight to explain how one combination of elements made possible 2 distinct sets of abilities. Until this time, the classical powers were known as philosophies, or the loves of wisdom, and the discovery that the rank or personality of individuals did not alter the character of the powers. The discovery that fighters and rogues exploited abilities deriving from the same reciprocal elements eventually led to an addendum to Agrigentum's system. Early on, it rendered the term class the far more common designation for practices of a classical power in the domain. Literally, to clarify for young scholars, the phrase classical power does not mean ancient power inasmuch as it designates the classes of powers in the Arcane Age. End footnote. In the years immediately following Agrigentum's writings and the discovery of 6 classical powers, many elders and middle-aged persons contributed to a growing list of lesser abilities in all philosophies. In general, though, most proved incapable of mastering more powerful effects or tricks that did not come naturally to them. In the centuries that followed, parents introduced children to Agrigentum's concept of the 4 elements with diagrams and 6-sided dice that depicted the combination of the 4 elements in pairs. See Illustration 4. Illustration 4. Representation of the classical powers. An interlacing diagram of the 4 elements. The arcane peoples came to understand that the 4 elements may be represented as 6 different pairs of elements. This could then be shown as a cubic diagram or a 3-dimensional diagram in which each side had 2 combinations of elements. The preternatural age stone dice shown here was recovered from the archaeological dig site at Titios. And Illustration 4. In the centuries that followed, parents introduced children to Agrigentum's concept of the 4 elements with diagrams and 6-sided die that depicted the combination of the 4 elements in pairs. Each pairing of the 4 symbols for the elements represented one of the classical powers. For instance, the combined symbols for Ether and Geos signified wizardry. In this manner, children throughout the domain, regardless of culture, received a basic education in arcane philosophy. In addition, systems of formal training and rites of passage known as apprenticeships became standard practice for each of the 6 classical powers. Soon after a person's first 13 years of life, the triskaidecade. Footnote 22. Arcane peoples regarded a period or segment of 13 years as the logos or rhythm of complex life forms. End footnote. Soon after a person's first 13 years of life, the triskaidecade, when puberty transforms the body from that of a child to that of an adult, most youth learned whether they possessed an aptitude for a classical power. Thereafter, all but the most facile abilities in the classical powers required years of deliberate studies and an apprenticeship under a master. Consequently, each city became closely associated with the classical power that its denizens first revealed. Naxos became the capital of clerics, no matter what city a cleric claimed as birthplace. The towers of Panoptes attracted adolescent wizards from the furthest outskirts of the domain. Footnote 23. The wizards of Agrigentum's tower created their own shadow guild for commoners who preferred not to work with nobles or under the watchful eye of the godhead. In effect, there were two ivory towers, or universities, for the study of wizardry. See Brew, Naxian Ethic, page 397. End footnote. Naxos became the capital of clerics no matter what city a cleric claimed his birthplace. The towers of Panoptes attracted adolescent wizards from the furthest outskirts of the domain. Fighters scaled the mountain stairs of Pallene to intensify their combat readiness, while rogues slipped in and out of Tityos, serving the nebulous interests of their guildmasters and the city's godhead. Druids sojourned to Libya for an apprenticeship that, though less complicated than wizardry, required communion with the soil of the Central Plains for no less than 7 years. Footnote 24. As a result, the Druids' regiment daunted even those who learned to use the healing roots and seeds with great facility. End footnote. Over this time, the 7 cities of the Godheads came to share a common culture that centered on the persons and guilds that commanded the classical powers, rather than the 7 distinct statement of principles and codes of laws handed down by the municipalities' Godheads. With one exception. The Godhead of Alcyoneus, mindful that its city held the ignoble distinction of being the only population that did not witness the discovery in the classical powers, dedicated his desert metropolis to research on the final and still undiscovered mysteries of Anime and Zephyr. On the surface, the Godhead's hubris turned the city into an object of mockery throughout the domain. The arid climate and infertile soil limited the availability of water and foodstuffs, making life in Alcyoneus harsh and inhospitable. Always the least populated of the 7 cities, the statement of principles commanded the denizens to favor self-sacrifice and communal tranquility above all other values. The first 2 lines of the Alcyonian statement of principles read, "From each according to one's ability, to each according to one's necessity." Footnote 25. Long before most peoples of the domain began to regard the Godhead's governments as repressive bureaucracies or anachronistic institutions, the Alcyonians believed that lawfulness and goodness blossomed together in the beauty of the commune. End footnote. The first 2 lines of the Alcyonian statement of principles read, "From each according to one's ability, to each according to one's necessity." The commoners embraced the expression as the embodiment of their will and rotated the duties of office such that the hereditary nobility in Alcyonius ceased to exist after the discovery of the classical powers. Given such a state of affairs, few nobles from the other cities ever bothered to make the trek to Alcyoneus to research the arcane powers of Anime and Zephyr. Instead, the city became something of a continental hub for commoners who refused to accept their inability to channel one of the 6 known wisdoms. And for nearly 3 centuries, no commoner proved equal to the task of acquiring knowledge of the second arcane wisdom. Yet, many settled in the desert fortress, convinced that the city offered a better quality of life and in hopes that the contemplation combined with mutualism may one day divulge that last classical power. In Alcyoneus, we make destiny, the local denizens were fond of saying. Exactly 293 years after the simultaneous discoveries in Pallene and Tityos, a citizen of Alcyoneus reconciled the forces of the 2 life elements. He was a son of immigrants to the city whose mother's family from Libya settled in the city 7 heptadecades earlier, and whose father's family arrived from Naxos only 2 heptadecades earlier. Footnote 26. For those who have not yet mastered the arcane modes of measuring time, that is 7 times 17, or about 119 years, for the mother's family, and 2 times 17, or 34 years, for the father's family. End footnote. In a certain respect, the discovery by Omodamos, footnote 27. Omodamos became the honorary surname of all paladins apprenticed in Alcyoneus. The name has been passed down to us in the few sources that specifically identify a former paladin, such as Bryja Omodamos, in the Dunastes papers. The modern term paladin is similar in pronunciation of the arcane term, but has lost much of its past meaning. In the Arcane Age, the word for paladin was Philodomon, or one who loves the people. End footnote. In a certain respect, the discovery by Omodamos validated the aspirations of the Alcyonians who migrated to the region and created the unique ethos of the city. For such as it was, paladins became known as fierce defenders of the people, the most prominent class and the highest-minded philosophers of the preternatural age. Born in the vast emptiness of the desert, the paladins eschewed worldly delights and personal possessions that failed to empower them with a greater ability to protect the common folk. Dedicated to harmonizing the mobile and immobile forces of life, paladins despised all things that disrupted social concord or perverted biologic entities. The annihilation of social and physiological discord seemed to be the crux of all their skills. Regarding their powers as solemn duties, most paladins believed themselves to be vanguards of the oppressed. Endowed with powers to rid the domain of political inequality and monstrous abominations. Unsurprisingly, denizens of the 6 other cities often considered paladins, if not all Alcyonians, as insufferable guests. Many philosophers in the other classical powers, especially those who experimented with daemons, golems, or the hybridization of life forms, refused to consort with the officious class. Footnote 28. The lengthy account of the classical powers in the ICA's Commoner's Manifesto references a work by the paladin Protabdera called On the Gods and Disobedience, published in Paline in the 4th epoch 7th period of the Arcane Age. Like many original works, Protabdera's Tracts was lost sometime after the First Great War, and now only 2 fragments of Protabdera survive. Both hint at the radical implications of his thought. The first suggests Protabdera questioned the divinity of the godheads. No means of knowing whether the gods exist, what purpose or utility the gods serve, if not to obscure the brevity of life. The second piece seems to describe a theory of knowledge that challenged the godhead's authority. The common folk are the measure of all things. Of things that are good, that they benefit all. Of things that are monstrous, that they harm any. End footnote. With the emergence of the paladins, moreover, the 7 godheads no longer underestimated the revolutionary implications of arcane philosophy. The paladins closed the chronicle of the first centuries of the classical powers under the auspices of the godheads, and the discovery of the original 7 classes or wisdoms known to preternatural arcanists. Whether from the curse of a common peasant or the healing power of a cow-herding noble, the discovery of the classical powers forever changed the course of history in the domain. The common folk's attention, no longer absorbed by worship and hunger, energetically turned to the study of arcane philosophy. The mechanic arts blossomed into an inventive and thriving industry to complement the fortunate individuals who mastered the classical powers in long hours of study and contemplation. The mercantile cartels secured their tolls for the distribution of goods, services, and discoveries toted across the grave expanse of the domain. Families reared children with an aspiration to study arcane philosophy or acquire a competency in one of the many trades of the mechanic arts. Citizens of the 7 cities more frequently questioned the meager existence and unconditional reverence demanded under the tutelage of the godheads. In time, the middling ranks asserted their natural rights to the fruits of their labors, chiding the godheads as issuers of law for law's sake, rather than the rule of law for the public good. In sum, the common folk's taste for empowerment and knowledge in nature mobilized an entirely new culture that became a harbinger for a new age, an age in which the godheads of the 7 cities lost custody of humankind. And this concludes Chapter 2 of Arcane Cage.